My name is Dana Abbott, and welcome to my backyard. This episode, we're going to cover a few different aspects of the sword. One of them in particular is how to work in your stance for Dodan. Basically, when you lift the sword up in this manner, a lot of times when people come down, they want to sit into it. Actually, if you look a little pigeon-toed to readjust the muscles in your leg, then when you come down, you're going to be coming down in a more forward direction. So if I bring the sword in and I come down this way, it will be a lot better than bringing the sword down this way because you'll be putting more weight onto the blade. That's why heavy people, they have a better time cutting because they can put more weight behind the blade. How we could do it when we have a smaller stature is to make sure that our sword is working with our center mass and the angles of our stance is set forward. This way, you'll find out that you got a much better cut. Now, if I lift up here and I work down with Dodan, you can see that the Monouchi is parallel to the ground. Moreover, you see that Duke, my dog, is here. You know, there are a lot of safety things you have to think about when you're using a sword, especially in your surroundings, for example, your backyard. You know, a lot of times my dog is in the way. Mostly I do all my sorting in a school. Although when you're out there and you're working, make sure that everything's cleared of your area and don't assume everything's cleared. Dog just comes in a second. They sit down, you're swinging around, you fall over them, you fall on the sword, or moreover, you swing down and you take out the dog's backside or cut off a tail. I wouldn't stress this enough. Make sure that all your animals are sound, safe, and away from a sword. At a different angle, let me explain this one more time, away from my animal. You lift the sword up. A lot of the times, again, everybody wants to sit into it, where you're using a lot of these muscles. Actually, you want to swing down, cast out, creating a Shinshoku-giri or a 12-6 cut, and then when you get to about here, just right when the blade is starting to become parallel to the floor, and again, it's the Monouchi and not this part. Usually people try to cut on a Dodan, and a lot of times everything comes in at an angle, and they don't get a real true cut that is nice and flat. So remember, from this angle too, you can see my knees coming forward a little bit more. Almost to the point like if I fell over, I could put the sword tip down and I'd be like a tripod here. It isn't about getting low with the target. It's about putting up enough energy, swinging down hard, and making sure you cut with the least amount of resistance. When one cuts with their hips, it requires a lot of center mass and how to adjust it perfectly. A lot of times, as I said earlier in Dodan, if you have a lot of weight behind the blade, you can cut through most anything pretty well. But when you have a different stature, such as mine, for example, I have to use more technique because I can't throw that weight in behind it. Therefore, I cut with my hips. Cutting with your hips isn't that difficult. It's just a thought process that we do all the time, but we haven't applied it to the sword, especially when we're cutting various objects. And when we're cutting various objects in a backyard or surroundings, a lot of time you don't give it your 100% focus just because you're worried about a neighbor looking over the fence. A lot of times backyard cutters ask me, well, how can I get someone to accept me using a sword in the backyard? You can't. It's just that you look like a crazy guy. I look like a crazy guy if I'm outside the dojo in my street clothes. Although when you're in the privacy of your own home, you have a tendency to do whatever you want. Now, in my privacy of my home, there is no one looking over the fence. And since everybody knows that I do the sword, no one's going to say anything. But there are a lot of us out there that live in apartments or houses that have smaller backyards or patio yards where it's really hard to execute technique. And, of course, you got a lot of people watching. Probably what I would do is I would practice more at night, and don't try to have everybody accept for what you do, because there's people down the street, the crazy woman, the guy that thinks there's bombs around the thing, or someone doing this or something do that. You can always find crazy people in the neighborhood. You're just part of it now. So don't dwell on what people think. Just make sure when they see you, you look safe and not crazy. Or I would clear out an area in your garage if you could do that without swinging up high, because remember, most of us are cutting smaller objects, so we can cut out of a hostile position instead of lifting up for something like a dodon or trying to act like you're going to cut off an elephant leg. You might as well keep it tight. Remember, there's a caliber for every use. You're not going to shoot a rabbit with a 10-gauge shotgun. You'll probably use a 22. Same thing with swords and the techniques. There are techniques for big, strong, full kills, and there are techniques for little bitty things like taking off someone's thumb so they can't hold a sword. But back to cutting with the hips. If I come in here and I'm cutting here with a mono-uchi, the sweet spot, and I stand about right here, I don't need to come up like this and cut it way down. All I need to do is hold it about right like this and throw a little bit shiboto into it, or a little bit more ringing in the blade. So when I hold it like this and I cut down, you can see it cuts fairly easy that way. Now, this is a pretty sharp cut as far as not being a really good angle. But you can see, out of the blue, I just threw my hands forward a tad, and it worked out well. Watch me use my hips again. I'm just going to lift this up like this and come down with the weight. See how that works? Now, let me do it a little bit more and a little bit more forward, where I go into it using my hips a little bit more. And see how that works. Now remember, since I'm throwing my hips into it and I'm trying to express this by showing you this, the cuts won't be as good. You'll still cut a lot. But I want you to remember, you have to adjust it to your body that works well, to make it work better. So if I lift up the sword here and I don't want to cut that far and I want to use my hips and I want to go forward into the target instead of out, then I'll come up on my toes a little bit, adjust my elbows and my forearms closer to create more of a point. So this is more like a hypodermic needle now coming down. And now you can see how much better the cut is becoming. Mainly because it's down a little lower and I can work it closer to my hips. And if I come in here a little bit more like this, and I'll just push forward and pull my arm like this, watch, and that's using your hips. Now, a lot of times in kendo, you see people stomp in there like that. That's showing the teachers that they're spot on. So if I come in here like kendo a little bit, I put a little chirp into it, and I stomp into it, look at the difference. Now you can see that I'm really pushing my hips. So when you want to use your hips, adjust them, put them behind the blade, make sure your forearms are tight, because that will promote better ringing of the blade. A lot of us are like this, and when we come on up, it just takes too much time. So you have one good cut and one poor cut. Moreover, when you lift the sword above your head, make sure there's no air between here. Make sure your arms frame your head like this. Then your cuts will be a lot better, more consistent, and spot on. So while you're in the backyard, you're thinking, well, should I ki-eye really loud and make a big cut, or should I be quiet? It all depends on the cuts and the technique you're using. A lot of people want to know, well, how do you breathe? Well, there are various ways. Like shooting a firearm. You breathe in, you squeeze the trigger. You don't yank the trigger and breathe hard, because it will take you from being consistent and you won't always hit the same area of the target. Same thing with a sword. But a lot of people go, I don't remember breathing. Well, here's case in point. Back in the 80s, I was an avid skydiver. If I didn't put in 5 dives a week, I'd get the shakes. With that thought, I want you to know that people would ask me questions like, how do you breathe? And I'd think, well, I don't know, I didn't think about it. A matter of fact, since I'm still around, it works out really well. But here's a good case in point, which I was taught by my teachers, is the more air that you push out, the more air that comes back in naturally. So if I go like this and I hold my breath and I'm doing a little tweak, a little squeak like this, I'm not going to breathe well. But if I breathe in, set up, and then make the shot, or make the shot if I'm going at it tooth and nail, because there's always a time to breathe hard and soft. But make sure that it just is nice and smooth and consistent, which will also work on making your technique nice, smooth, and also consistent. There are a lot of people out there who think about how to apply weight training to their sword work. They want to work and develop a muscle here or a muscle there. Well, note this. The samurai 500 years ago didn't do weight training. They just had a 3-foot long, 2-pound sword that they manipulated all the time that gave them the muscle and tone that they needed. In this day and age, we want to try different ways of how to build up our muscles so we get stronger and better. Mostly it isn't about how strong your muscles are, is how trained you have your muscle in rote memory, your muscle memory, to the point where you are consistent and your technical part of your strike is perfect, spot on. Although, when we talk about weight training, there are a couple things we can think about. Remember, if we're playing baseball and just right before we get up and bat, we take a couple bats, and we take that weight and we put it on the bat, and we swing it around so when we take it off it feels a lot lighter. Mostly you'll see that with weight training with the sword. Of course, you could go to a gym and work on different aspects. But the greatest swordsmen that I ever saw never went into a weight room. They started using something like a tsuburito, which is a big piece of wood, and this isn't that big, but a heavier big piece of wood that, looks like a sword, or it's so big it looks like a big cylinder or a small limb. They use that a lot. And when they practice techniques, they don't go fast. They go slow because they don't want to pull any muscles. That's another big aspect. If you're using a really heavy sword and you're applying it harder than your muscles can handle, you'll gain injuries. So remember, the heavier the sword you have, the slower you must go. If you're driving a big truck compared to a sports car, you can see the analogy there. Nevertheless, when you start working with a longer or heavier sword like this, probably your best bet is to do repetition. With repetitive techniques, you can start gaining that muscle mass in the areas that you need to, without hindering you with doing too much, so you'll slow yourself down. Moreover, when you lift up the sword and you start casting it out and casting it up this way, start working on the Miyamoto motor, the 4 and 8 different directions you can cut at 8 different angles. That's what I want you to think about in the future. So if you want to know a little bit more about the Miyamoto motor, don't hesitate to go over to learnthesword.com, go into the workout blog, which is there for everybody to view, and go to the Miyamoto motor so you can see how to get more repetition. The average repetition on the Miyamoto motor is about 40 strikes per minute, which is a big amount compared to just practicing kata, where in 4 or 5 minutes you might only get 15 strikes in. Moreover, when you start working your muscle memory and you start working on those aspects with weight training, where do you want to put the weight? You want to put it in your shoulders, you want to put it in your sides, you want to put it into your legs. Makes you think, doesn't it? Most all swords people have bigger forearms, and they have them that are, what would we say, you can see all the muscles in it. Now, my forearms aren't that big anymore. I'm past that stage. But as you can see, for 58 years old this year, they still hold up. So practicing the sword will take you way into your 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s and make sure you're healthy. A lot of people out there have questions about the belt or obi that you use. There are hundreds of styles and lengths of obis and colors. There are hundreds of different ways to tie it. It's as individual as the person itself. Of course, if you go to a certain school, they'll tie it that certain way. But here's a case in point. I remember being in the Budokan back in the mid-80s, and I'd run into all these different masters, mostly kendo masters and iaido masters, and of course, being the only foreigner there, they take you underneath their wing, and they'd show you different things. Well, I would be shown how to tie a belt, and it's a really nice one, and then I'd walk around and look around, and about 2 or 3 minutes later, another, 80-year-old sword master would come up to me and he'd say, "Who tied your belt?" and they'd readjust it. And 10 minutes later, I'm walking around, and some other individual would come up and he goes, "Who tied your belt?" So everybody's correct. So don't fault anybody for anything, but just do what you like, which is comfortable. What I've discovered is that when you tie a belt around you in your kendo gi, for example, or a gi, for example, you have it so it rests on the hips. So it's a little loose around the side, but when it touches the hips, it becomes a little bit tighter around there. That way, the sword won't feel bad when you're moving it around. Because a lot of different styles have to move the saya or the sheath around the belt to get the techniques in that particular kata that they want to. And let's talk about that. Before we worry about it, instead of putting on a traditional obi like this, I'm going to put on something. This is one of these neoprene rubber things. All you do is you bring it around your side like this and it velcros right on like that. And then you take it and you drop it down in half like this. What's going to happen is, boom, it's ready to go. And it's waterproof and you don't have to worry about it. Another point is taking the sword and then putting it into your belt. Now, as you can see, this neoprene rubber works pretty good. And I'll take this and I'll just slide it in there really easily. So say the belt is adjusted over on your side and you're thinking, well, how do you pull the sword out? Remember, you have to have, or you don't have to, but it's wise that you work on your basic triangle this way. So you're halfway in between. Because if I have to reach way over to this side here like this, it looks like this is all open. Now, in our backyards, when we're cutting small objects, this doesn't really apply, but yes, it does. Because this is the beginning of learning how to work with center mass, cutting with your hips, and how to properly hold, draw, and sheath the sword. A lot of us draw the swords out this way, and then all of a sudden, it just doesn't feel long enough, and we lean forward. Instead of doing that, lift it up at about a 45-degree angle, and it'll come out a lot easier. That's one way to draw the sword. Now, when we start moving, you notice that if I'm working to a person to my right, I'm not going to have the sword pointing to the left. I should have my sword pointing on the target I want to cut. Because if I don't set up for the cut, it isn't going to work. They'll see me telegraph. Now, of course, if we're cutting inanimate objects, you can do whatever you like, but why don't you start taking extra steps out of your technique to be more spot on? So, if I was cutting to the right, instead of coming out this way and trying to cut this way, I turn it in as my note, and I cut this way. So look at those aspects. Make sure that you can move the sword around. It's like having a firearm and you have a holster. Everybody that has a holster with the firearm, they pull out the gun out of the holster their own special way. If they go to a really hard or real difficult school, like a gun sight, for example, you're going to start learning how to do this over and over and over again so you create a good, strong base. That's the most important part. Doing Noto isn't that difficult. Being consistent and always having the weapon on the target, so when you draw the sword, it draws correctly to set up correctly to execute the technique correctly, then you got it made. But there's no special secret mysteries around this. It's just as simple as pulling out a firearm out of a holster and shooting. Just making sure that your holster is adjusted to your body and the way you're going to shoot. You wouldn't have your holster back here and your target's over there, unless you're Barney Fife. But that's another story.